Tonight we are walking through the history of Christmas, from ancient winter survival to Roman parties, saintly secret gifts, Northern Yule fires, medieval mangers, Victorian cozy rules, and the modern season that somehow arrives earlier every year. This is a calm bedtime story with light sarcasm, soft tension, and just enough truth to make the candles feel earned. Get comfortable, let the lights go low, and let us follow the winter trail of how humans kept choosing warmth. Chapter 1. The long winter before Christmas existed. The museum is quiet in the way only winter evenings can manage. Outside, Oslo is doing its usual December performance. The air is cold, the sky is dark. Everyone is either walking quickly or pretending they are not walking quickly. Inside, the lights are soft and steady, which is how humans have always tried to argue with the season. I am here with a set of keys and a polite sense of responsibility. You could call me a guide, you could call me a caretaker, you could call me a person who has listened to many sincere opinions about Christmas and has survived all of them. I do not judge, I only remember. In a glass case near the entrance there is a small bundle of dried evergreen. It looks ordinary. That is the trick. Most traditions begin as ordinary objects that worked well enough in the dark. Someone picked a branch. Someone brought it indoors. Someone noticed that it stayed green while everything else looked like it had given up. Someone decided this meant something. And then, because humans cannot just let a useful idea stay simple, the branch became a symbol and a debate, and eventually an argument in a supermarket. Tonight we begin before Christmas existed as a named thing. Before nativity scenes and candlelit hymns, before Santa had a brand strategy, before anyone could say the phrase Christmas spirit and expect everyone to nod politely. We begin with winter itself, the original plot twist. In the far north, winter is not only a season, it is a mood with practical consequences. The days shrink until the sun seems like a rumour. The wind makes decisions for you. Food does not simply appear unless you were sensible months ago. And even if you were sensible, winter still keeps you humble. In earlier centuries, the cold did not arrive with cozy marketing. It arrived with question. Will the animals survive? Will the stored grain last? Will the family stay healthy? Will the water freeze? Will the roof hold? Will the neighbours share? Will the firewood run out? It was not romantic. It was work and waiting and listening to the weather like it was an important relative. In that kind of world, people did what people always do. They made meaning. They made rules. They made stories. They made gatherings where they could say to one another, yes, it is dark, but we are still here. This is where winter festivals come from. Not from boredom, from stubbornness, from the simple, quiet choice to add a light when the world turns down the dimmer. I walk slowly past a long display of tools. Flint, simple knives, hooks, little things that look unimpressive until you remember what they replaced. The first person who made a reliable flame was not thinking about holiday aesthetics. They were thinking about not freezing. But once fire became reliable, it became more than survival. It became comfort. It became a place to gather. It became a reason to sing softly while hands warmed and soup simmered. Winter was also the season of accounting. Not the kind with spreadsheets, but the kind with faces. How many mouths? How much food? How long until the spring? People took stock and made decisions. If it felt tense, that is because it was. And if the tension sometimes spilled into festivals, that is also because it was. A festival can be a release valve. A festival can say, for this night, we will not talk about the thing we are all thinking about. Or we will talk about it, but with bread and laughter so it does not take over the room. Across Europe, and across much of the ancient world, the middle of winter carried a certain message. The sun reaches its lowest point, then, slowly, it turns back. The days begin to lengthen, so slightly at first that you have to be the kind of person who pays attention, which, in a pre-electric world, most people were. The winter solstice is an event you can feel in your bones if you live with it long enough. It is not a theory, it is the night that seems to stretch. It is the week when you cannot remember what daylight feels like, and then, quietly, it eases. The return is subtle, but it is real. That is enough. It is not strange that people made festivals for this. It would be strange if they did not. In the museum case, near the evergreen, there is also a small clay lamp. It is not dramatic. It is the size of a hand. It once held oil and a wick. It once made a small pool of light in a dark room. That small pool meant you could see a face. It meant you could mend a tearing cloth. It meant you could tell a story and watch the eyes of the listeners. It meant you could share bread without guessing where the table was. Light is a practical thing. Humans turned it into a sacred thing because it deserves respect. If we move south in our minds toward the Mediterranean, winter is different, but it is still a turning point. The days are shorter, the harvest is done, the sea can be rough, the year feels old. Even in warmer climates there is a sense of pause, a sense of reflection, a sense that the world is preparing to begin again. Ancient peoples watched the sky with the attention of professional critics. They observed patterns, they tracked the sun, they aligned stones and buildings, they kept calendars, because the ability to predict the seasons is the ability to survive them. And once you can predict, you can plan. And once you can plan, you can celebrate. Celebrations were often tied to gods, yes, but they were also tied to communal life, to the need for everyone to agree that the year was not falling apart, to the need for a shared rhythm. In times without constant entertainment, shared rituals were the biggest performance in town. And in times without modern medicine, shared rituals were also a way to manage fear. If you do the right things at the right time, maybe the world will keep going. This is the original calm bargain. We will do our part, and the cosmos will do its part. It is not so different from modern life, except that now we pretend we do not believe in rituals while we stand in line for seasonal pastries and call it tradition. I stop at another case. A simple wooden bowl. A few carved figures that might have been toys or might have been small household spirits, depending on who is telling the story. There is a quiet theme here. Humans keep making small objects to hold hope. They keep making containers both for food and for meaning. So, before Christmas there were many midwinter traditions. Not one, but many. Each region had its own flavour. Some were solemn, some were rowdy, some were deeply spiritual, some were mostly about eating the good food before it's spoiled, which is a respectable motive. In the north people gathered, they feasted when they could, they told stories of ancestors, they spoke to the unseen, they made offerings, they sang, they watched the fire, they treated the dark as something you could sit with, not something you could defeat. In other places, there were festivals that marked the end of the year and the beginning of a new cycle. There were moments when social order loosened, when the powerful pretended to be ordinary for a day, and the ordinary got to feel powerful for a day. It was not always safe, it was not always kind, but it was a recognition that life is heavy, and sometimes you have to lift the weight by laughing. And then there were the evergreen branches. Evergreen is the perfect winter symbol because it is not pretending, it does not lie, it is alive when much of the landscape looks asleep. It smells sharp and clean. It brings the outdoors inside without bringing snow on your shoes, unless someone is careless, which they often are. Evergreens were used long before Christmas trees. People hung branches in halls. They placed them above doorways. They decorated spaces with greenery that stayed green. Sometimes it was about beauty. Sometimes it was about protection. Sometimes it was about telling the dark you cannot have everything. You can imagine a household in a long winter. The walls are timber. The roof is heavy. The fire is the heart of the room. The smell of smoke is everywhere because it has nowhere else to go. Someone brings in a bundle of pine or fir. They shake it off. They set it where it can be seen. The room changes. Not much, but enough. That is tradition. Not a grand decree, but a small change that makes people breathe easier. There is a quiet tension, though, even here at the beginning. The tension is this. Nature does not care about our feelings. The solstice comes whether we celebrate it or not. The sun returns whether we sing or not. And yet we celebrate anyway. because the celebration is not for the sun, it is for us. It is how we keep each other from becoming too silent. And silence in winter can be the kind that feels safe, or the kind that feels like giving o. The early winter festivals did not need to be calm, but many of them had calm within them. A pause, a moment where people sat, listened, and noticed that they were not alone. That is the seed, a quiet seed, planted in the dark. I walk down a hallway where the museum keeps old calendars, not paper ones with cheerful pictures, but carved marks and carefully recorded patterns. In a world without electric light, time is not something you manage with alarms. It is something you survive with attention. People had to know when the days would change. They had to know when it was safe to travel. They had to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to store, when to rest. Winter was the season that proved whether you had been wise. And yet, people always made room for something extra, for decoration, for small gifts, for shared food, for a song that everyone knew, for telling children, yes, it is dark, but listen, it will turn. So Christmas did not arrive into an empty space. It arrived into a crowded season full of older customs. It arrived into a calendar where midwinter was already important. It arrived into homes where people already lit lamps and brought in greenery and told stories of what mattered. This is how most cultural things happen. They do not erase what came before, they blend, they borrow, they negotiate, they insist they are new while wearing an old coat. In the next chapter we will step into Rome, where they were very good at festivals and also very good at pretending they were not being dramatic. We will meet Saturnalia, which is like a party that forgot to include an off switch. We will see gift-giving, role reversal, and the comforting human belief that if we laugh loudly enough, winter will not notice us. For now, we stay here, before the name Christmas, when the main event was the turning of the light, when the simple act of gathering was enough, when a sprig of evergreen could do the work of a whole speech. The museum lights dim slightly as the building settles into night mode. Outside, the darkness does what it always does. It presses against the windows like it wants to be included. Inside, the lamp in the glass case cannot burn any more, but its shape still says what it once said. Humans make light. Humans share it. Humans remember to do this again each year, even when they complain about it. Chapter 2, Rome and Saturnalia, the original seasonal chaos with manners. When you step into ancient Rome in midwinter, the first thing you notice is that it is loud in a confident way. Not loud like a storm, but loud like a city that believes it is the center of the world and would like you to stop pretending you have not heard. I know Rome is far from Oslo, and I know time travel is not included in the museum ticket. Still, the mind can travel quietly. It can drift over seas and centuries without needing to pack a coat. And if you follow the trail of winter festivals, you end up in Rome sooner or later, because Rome had a talent for collecting other people's ideas and giving them new paperwork. The streets are narrow in places, and the stones are worn smooth by feet that have been hurrying for a very long time. The air smells like smoke, oil lamps, and food that is being prepared with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for politics. Somewhere nearby, a vendor is insisting that their goods are necessary for your dignity. Somewhere else, a wealthy household is opening its doors to guests who will pretend to be polite while secretly measuring the quality of the wine. It is December, or the Roman version of December, which is close enough for our purposes. The days are short, the nights arrive early, and the city is preparing for Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a festival in honor of Saturn, an old Roman god linked to agriculture and an earlier idealized age. People like to imagine that in that distant golden time life was easier and everyone was less irritating. This is a common fantasy. The past is always simpler right up until you remember the parts where you had no plumbing and your teeth were slowly making decisions for you. Saturnalia began on the 17th day of December in the Roman calendar and eventually stretched longer. Rome was good at extending celebrations. The empire expanded, and so did the parties. It is what you do when you have power and a taste for spectacle. During Saturnalia, normal rules relaxed. Not all rules. Rome did not become a kind utopia, but certain social edges softened for a while. People greeted one another more freely. They wore more relaxed clothing. They allowed themselves to laugh at things that were usually handled with a stiff face. There were feasts. Of course there were feasts. Rome had many skills, and one of them was eating with purpose. There were also gifts, often small ones, candles, figurines, simple items that said, "I thought of you," and also, "I did not spend too much, so please do not begin a competitive spiral." The Romans even had a word for gift-giving, and the seasonal exchange became part of the rhythm. If you have ever felt the mild social tension of receiving a gift that is slightly too thoughtful, you have touched an ancient tradition. Saturnalia also had a playful reversal element. In some households, enslaved people were allowed to speak more freely, to joke, and sometimes to sit at the table. In some traditions, masters served their enslaved workers, at least symbolically, as a kind of ritual role swap. This sounds charming when described quickly, which is the point. It is also complicated, because a temporary performance does not erase the actual structure underneath it. Still, even a temporary break in the script tells you something. It tells you that everyone knew the script was heavy. It tells you that everyone understood the power of pretending, for a short time, that things could be different. In a Roman household, Saturnalia might begin with preparations that look almost modern. People clean, people cook, people argue about what is necessary. Someone thinks the table needs more decoration. Someone else says it is fine, it is always fine, why is everyone like this? The household head wants the event to go smoothly, because reputation matters and neighbors talk. A cook wants the food to be good, because a cook is judged more harshly than a senator in some circumstances. A child wants sweets and does not care about anyone else's concerns. And then the guests arrive, carrying the season on their shoulders. Imagine a domus on the Palatine Hill or near the Forum, with a courtyard and a small garden that looks like a calm pause inside the city. Lamps glow. The walls hold painted scenes of myths and landscapes, which is a polite way of saying the Romans liked to decorate with stories. The floor is mosaic, the air is warm from braziers, the table is set, and it is not subtle. Someone is wearing a pileus, a soft cap linked with freedom, because Saturnalia invited people to play with symbols. Someone else is wearing a brighter tunic than usual, because the festival allowed a little more colour, a little more looseness. People greet tot another with a cheerful phrase that became the season marker, Io Saturnalia. It is the Roman version of saying, it is that time again, and we are going to pretend we are not exhausted. I have always found it comforting that even ancient Rome needed a permission slip to relax. Humans love rules, and then they invent holidays to step around them. Then they argue about the holidays and turn them into rules again. It is a cycle as reliable as the solstice. The feast itself is a slow ritual. Dishes arrives, bread, olives, cheese, fish, meat when available, fruits preserved in honey, nuts, wine, watered or not, depending on who is trying to impress whom. The room fills with the sound of conversation and the clink of cups. Laughter rises and falls like a tide. This is where the soft tension lives. It is not danger. It is the gentle pressure of being together. In every era, a feast is a performance. People show who they are. People show who they wish they were. People show how much they can afford to show. In Rome, status was a language spoken with clothing, with seating, with who was invited, with who was allowed to speak. Saturnalia loosened that language without deleting it. You might see a wealthy man smiling indulgently as someone makes a daring joke. He laughs. He signals that he is secure enough to allow it. You might see someone lower in status testing the limits, careful not to cross the invisible line that still exists. You might see an enslaved worker making a joke that lands well, then feeling the room, then choosing whether to add another. This is not a simple comedy. It is a comedy with a careful eye. In some households there was also the idea of a mock king, sometimes called a Saturnalia prince, a person chosen to give silly commands. Sing, dance, speak in verse, drink, wear something ridiculous. The point was to create playful disorder that was still contained. Rome loved controlled chaos. It made people feel free without making the powerful feel unsafe. If you are wondering why this matters for the history of Christmas, it is because Saturnalia helped shape the cultural weather of late December. It showed how a midwinter festival could involve feasting, gift-giving, candles, social warmth, and a public sense that the usual rules could soften for a while. Candles are especially important here. The Romans exchanged them as gifts, and they lit them during the dark season. A candle is a humble tool that becomes an emotional symbol the moment the sun disappears early. In the museum in Oslo, we keep old lamps behind glass. In Rome, light was a living thing that people fed with oil and wick and attention. To give someone light in winter is to give them time. It is to give them sight. It is to say, I want your home to feel less heavy. There is also the calendar itself. Romans had festivals layered through the year, but Saturnalia sat at a key moment. The year was turning. The agricultural cycle had paused. The city was taking a breath. People could look ahead. That ahead feeling matters. It is part of why winter holidays cling to the heart. They do not only mark what has happened, they suggest that something is about to begin again. Even if the beginning is small, even if it arrives slowly, even if it requires patience and more firewood. Now, because this is Rome, we must acknowledge that Rome did not agree on everything. There were traditionalists who worried that people were becoming too soft. There were moralists who believed joy was suspicious. There were poets who thought the festival was beautiful. There were officials who worried about order. There were merchants who loved the festival because it meant sales. There were ordinary people who loved it because it meant food and laughter. There were people who did not love it but endured it because everyone else was doing it. This is another timeless part of the story. A holiday is never only a holiday. It is also a mirror. It shows what a society values and what it fears. It shows who is included and who is not. It shows who is allowed to rest and who keeps working so others can rest. Even during Saturnalia, much of Rome still ran on labor that was not freely chosen. Food still had to be made, fires still had to be tended, streets still had to be watched. The city could relax only because someone else kept the wheels turning. That is not a Roman flaw alone, that is a human habit. Still, in the middle of this there was genuine warmth. There were households where people really did share more kindly. There were friendships strengthened by gifts. There were small acts of generosity. There were parents trying to make the season feel special for children who did not yet carry the full weight of the world. There were older people who remembered earlier winters and felt grateful to have reached another way. And there was the old idea of the Golden Age, a dream of a time when things were fairer, easier, more balanced. Saturnalia did not claim to restore that age, it hinted at it, it made a little theatre of it. It allowed people to taste the thought, even if the taste was brief. This is how winter holidays often work. They create a pocket in time, a small room inside the calendar where people can feel something different, even if only for a night. Then the room closes and ordinary life returns, but the memory of that room stays. People carry it into the dark days that follow. If you listen carefully, you can hear how this kind of festival might echo forward. Candles, gift-giving, feasting, public cheer, a sense of turning, a cultural agreement that midwinter deserves extra care. Later, when Christianity grew in the Roman world, it did not do so in a vacuum. It grew in cities full of existing traditions. It grew among people who already knew how to celebrate in December. It grew among people who already used light as a symbol. It grew in a calendar already crowded with meaning. This is not an accusation. It is a reality of human culture. New ideas arrive, and they speak in the language people already understand. As the night in Rome deepens, the lamps burn lower. The laughter settles into softer conversation. A guest slips out into the street, pulling a cloak tighter, and breathes in the cold air. The stars are sharp above the rooftops. The city hums behind walls. Somewhere in the distance, someone sings, not perfectly, but sincerely. Back in Oslo, the museum stays quiet. The evergreen branch rests behind glass. The clay lamp sits still. But if you have been listening, you can almost feel the Roman warmth through the centuries, not as heat, but as recognition. Midwinter is heavy. Humans respond by making it lighted. In the next chapter, we will move into the early Christian world where people tried to define a new feast without pretending the old season did not exist. We will see how a story of birth in a stable entered a world of candles and festivals, and how a date in late December began to look, in a calm and practical way, like it belonged. Chapter 3: A New Faith, a Familiar Season, and Careful Choices. If Saturnalia was Rome saying, "Please let us all breathe for a few days," then the early Christian world was Rome saying, "Please explain your beliefs in a way that does not cause a riot." Different energy, same winter. You could imagine the first Christians as people who did not have time for holiday branding. Many of them were busy doing the difficult work of building small communities in a complicated world. They gathered in homes, they shared meals, they cared for the sick, they tried to live by a message that sounded simple until you attempted it on a Tuesday. At first, the most important story was not a birth story, it was a life, a teaching, a death, and a resurrection story. The earliest Christian celebrations focused heavily on what became Easter, the remembrance of the resurrection. That makes sense. When you are trying to hold a fragile community together, you lead with the heart of the message. Birthdays, meanwhile, were not a big priority. In some parts of the ancient world, birthdays were more associated with rulers and with certain religious customs that Christians did not want to copy too closely. The early movement was also not trying to become a seasonal pastime. It was trying to survive and to make meaning. Still, humans are humans. Humans like stories that begin at the beginning. Humans like the soft light of origins. Humans like to picture a child, a mother, and a small room where the world changes quietly. The birth narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are not long, but they are vivid. They are full of movement, journeys, dreams, angels, a star, a manger, a stubborn sense that something important is happening without asking permission from the powerful. And like all powerful stories, these scenes began to settle into the imagination of believers. Not all at once, not in one official meeting where everyone agreed politely. It was slower. It spread through preaching, prayer, art, and the ordinary human habit of telling the same story again because it comforts you. As Christianity expanded through the Roman Empire, it moved through real places with real weather and real calendars. Jerusalem, where pilgrims would one day crowd the streets with hymns. Antioch, a city of trade and ideas where languages mixed like ingredients in a stew. Alexandria, a place of learning and argument where people could debate for hours and call it friendship. Rome, where everything eventually ended up, including opinions. And in those places, Christians lived next to neighbours who already had winter festivals, lamps in window, greenery indoors, public gatherings, gift-giving, songs. The season was already thick with meaning, so the new faith did not float above the calendar like a separate planet. It had to land somewhere. This is where the careful choices began. If you have ever tried to plan a family dinner, you know that dates are emotional. Now imagine trying to plan a feast day for a growing church spread across an empire, without group chats, and with the added challenge that some people think your religion is suspicious. You can see why this took time. Early Christians celebrated different aspects of the life of Jesus on different dates in different regions. In some places, January 6 became important as a day connected with the manifestation of Christ to the world. This could include the visit of the Magi, the baptism of Jesus, and in some traditions even the birth. The focus was not always separated neatly into categories. The stories were woven together, because human memory likes patterns more than footnotes. Meanwhile, the question of a specific date for the nativity, the birth, hovered like a polite guest who does not want to bother anyone but will not stop existing. There were a few ways people tried to reason about it. One approach was symbolic and theological rather than historical. Some early Christian thinkers liked the idea that important events in the life of Jesus lined up in meaningful ways. There was a tradition that the conception of Jesus happened on the same calendar date as the death of Jesus. If you place the death in late March, then adding 9 months leads you into late December. That logic was not about proving something with a birth certificate. It was about seeing divine order in time itself. And you might think, that is a very neat idea, and it is also a very human idea. We like symmetry. We like the sense that a story is shaped on purpose. A winter feast built on that kind of symmetry would feel spiritually satisfying, even if it did not settle every historical question. Another approach was simply practical. The church in Rome and other centres eventually had reasons to mark the birth of Christ separately from other celebrations. As Christianity became more visible, feasts helped shape identity. A calendar tells people who they are. It tells them what to remember together. It tells them what to sing about when life gets heavy. And winter, as we have already discussed, is the season when life gets heavy. By the 4th century, we see clearer evidence that Christians in Rome were celebrating the Nativity on December 25. The exact path of how that date became established is still discussed by scholars, but the pattern is clear enough. A midwinter birth celebration took root in the West, while January 6 remained important in the East, and over time both dates found their roles. December 25 emphasized the Nativity, January 6 emphasized Epiphany, the revealing of Christ to the nations, often linked to the Magi. This was not a clean handoff. It was a slow negotiation that happened through sermons, local customs, and the steady power of people showing up year after year. And yes, people also noticed that December was already full of Roman festivity. Saturnalia had set a tone of candles, gifts, and social warmth. There was also the symbolism of the sun itself. The return of light after the solstice was a theme that could be read in many ways. Christians could speak of Christ as light entering the world, and that message resonated in a season when everyone already felt the need for light. Now it is tempting to imagine a dramatic scene where church leaders sit down and say, "We will place Christmas here to replace the old parties." That makes for a tidy story and a satisfying sense of strategy. Real life is usually less tidy. Real life is people adopting practices for many reasons at once, sometimes without even noticing they are doing it. It was not only about competition with pagan festivals, it was also about the internal logic of Christian symbolism and about the pastoral reality that humans need rhythms of hope. Let us pause on that word pastoral. It means caring for people as they are, not as you wish they were. In winter, people are tired, people worry, people miss those who are gone, people feel lonely even in a crowd. A feast that says, God entered human life as a child, in an ordinary place among ordinary people, is a feast that meets the heart gently. It does not require you to be impressive, it requires you only to be present. So the birth story began to settle into a winter setting, even if the stable itself was not taking a position on the calendar. If you walk through Rome in this era, you can imagine small Christian communities growing more confident. They meet in homes, they light lamps, they share bread and wine, they talk about scripture, they care for one another. And as the years pass, they begin to mark seasons together, not only because they want to, but because shared time creates shared identity. There is also a quiet tension here, the kind that is very suitable for bedtime drama. It is the tension between purity and adaptation. Some believers wanted to keep clear distance from surrounding customs. They feared that borrowing the shapes of older festivals would blur the faith. They wanted Christian life to be distinct, disciplined, separate. They were not trying to ruin fun, they were trying to protect meaning. Other believers were more willing to adapt cultural forms, to fill them with new meaning. They understood that people already gathered in winter, already lit candles, already gave small gifts. Why fight human nature when you can guide it? This argument did not happen in one room, it happened in sermons and letters and quiet conversations. It happened as families decided what to do with their neighbour's invitation. It happened as new converts asked simple questions like, "So are we celebrating this now?" It happened as communities tried to honour their faith without turning into a lonely island. That is the soft tension that shapes the history of Christmas. Not an epic battle, but a series of choices about how to live in the world. As the feast developed, the storytelling deepened. The Nativity became more than a memory. It became a scene that people could enter with their imagination. Shepherds in fields at night, which is already a calm image if you ignore the logistics. A child in a manger, which is a humble image whether you are religious or not. A mother and her patient, overwhelmed partner, trying to understand what has just happened. Visitors arriving with gifts that are both meaningful and slightly impractical, because symbolic gifts are often not useful for running a household. These images grew into art, into songs, into liturgy, into the kind of tradition that feels old even when it is still new, and the light imagery grew with it. Christ as light, candles in dark churches, lamps in windows, the sense that winter is the right season to talk about hope entering the world quietly, because winter forces you to pay attention to quiet things. Back in Oslo, in our Museum of Memory, I stand again near the small clay lamp behind glass. It is not Roman in this display, but it could be. A lamp is a lamp. It says the same thing in many languages. Humans have always needed light. Humans have always needed a reason to gather. When Christianity began to shape a winter feast around the Nativity, it was not inventing the need, it was giving the need a new story and a new centre. In the next chapter we will move eastward to Constantinople, where faith and empire learned to share the same room without pretending it was always comfortable. We will see how Christmas became more official, more organised and more widely celebrated, with all the calm dignity and occasional bureaucracy that implies. For now, we end Chapter 3 with a simple truth that has survived every calendar revision. Winter asks the same question every year. How will you carry the dark? Humans keep answering with stories, with light, and with the steady decision to show up for one another. Chapter 4, Constantinople Paperwork Saints and the Steady Official Glow. Constantinople is the kind of city that makes you stand up straighter, even if you do not want to. It sits between seas, between continents, between ideas, and it knows it. It does not ask for attention, it assumes attention belongs to it, which is an efficient attitude for an imperial capital. If Rome felt loud and crowded, Constantinople feels polished and strategic. The streets still smell like smoke and food because humans do not change that quickly, but there is also the scent of power. You can feel it in the walls, in the gates, in the way people look over their shoulders before they speak too freely. Here, Christianity is no longer a small movement hiding in a side room. Here it is braided into public life, into law, into politics, into the rhythm of the city. The church is learning what it means to be large, influential, and watched. This is exciting, and also a little dangerous, because influence attracts opinions like bread attracts birds. And winter is still winter. The days are short, the wind off the water is sharp. People still crave warmth and light. The difference is that now, more than ever, the light is organised. In the museum back in Oslo, there is a stack of replicas of old documents, the kind that make visitors smile politely and move on. But documents are how empires breathe. In Constantinople, decisions become scrolls, feasts become official, debates become councils, and in that world, Christmas begins to take on a steadier shape. The story of the Nativity is still soft, a child, a mother, a stable. But when an empire adopts a feast, it adds a certain weight, it adds process. It adds people who are very concerned about the correct date, the correct prayers, and the correct length of the service. Some of these people are holy, some are simply organised. Often it is hard to tell the difference. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Constantinople was a major centre of Christian life. The city was founded by Constantine, and it became the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was also a place where theology and politics held hands constantly, sometimes gently, sometimes with a grip that left marks. If you want calm drama, this is an excellent setting, because the arguments are intense but the language is formal. People do not shout in the street about doctrine if they want to keep their career. They write letters, they deliver sermons, they gather in councils with enough incense to make the air itself feel undecided. Christmas in the East developed alongside other important feast days. Epiphany on January 6 remained very significant in many places, and the adoption of December 25 as the Nativity feast spread gradually. There were regional differences. Some communities held to January 6 for the birth. Others began to separate the celebrations, giving the Nativity its own day and keeping Epiphany as a distinct feast. Constantinople, being Constantinople, had an opinion. Over time, December 25 became established there as a celebration of the Nativity, while January 6 remained as Epiphany. This did not happen overnight. It happened through a mix of influence from Rome, local decisions, and the general momentum of a growing church that wanted shared rhythms. People will argue about many things, but they prefer not to argue about the calendar forever, because eventually someone has to book the choir. Now picture the city in late December. The great church spaces are being prepared, services are planned, candles are ready. The sound of chanting rehearses itself in the mind long before the first note is sung. Worshippers gather with that particular kind of winter seriousness, the kind that says, I am tired, but I am here, and I want to be part of something larger than my own worries. This is where Christmas becomes less private and more public. Not only a story told in a home, but a feast celebrated in grand buildings with domes and mosaics. The nativity scene, once imagined in a small stable, is now sung beneath golden ceilings. There is beauty in that. There is also a quiet irony because the story is about humility and the setting is unmistakably impressive. Humans cannot resist building magnificent rooms for humble truths. The liturgy of Christmas develops with care. Readings from scripture, hymns, prayers. The language of light grows stronger. Christ is praised as the light that shines in darkness. The darkness is not treated as evil in a childish way. It is treated as real. It is the setting in which hope matters. And then there are saints. Saints are another way humans manage history. A saint is a person turned into a memory with sharp edges. A saint becomes a story people can repeat. A saint becomes a model, sometimes inspiring, sometimes intimidating. In Constantinople, devotion to saints flourished. People asked saints for help. People named children after saints. People built churches to saints. People argued about saints in a way that suggests the saints were still in the room listening. Christmas as a feast existed within this larger world of devotion. The nativity was not floating alone. It was one jewel in a calendar full of jewels. Some days were solemn, some were joyful, some were both at once. The year became a map of sacred time. There is a human comfort in that. When life is uncertain, a calendar of meaning can feel like a railing you can hold while you walk through the dark. But the comfort came with tension. Because when you decide that a feast matters, you have to decide what it means. And when you decide what it means, you have to decide what it does not mean. That is where debates begin. Constantinople was a place where the nature of Christ was debated intensely. How is Jesus both human and divine? How do these truths fit together without collapsing into nonsense? People cared about this not because they enjoyed being difficult, though some certainly did, but because they believed salvation and reality itself depended on getting it right. These debates could become heated, but in the way of an educated argument with long sentences and strong convictions. Councils met, creeds were shaped, leaders were praised or condemned, and ordinary believers tried to keep up, often focusing on the parts they could hold in their hands. A candle, a hymn, a feast meal, a story of a child. Christmas, with its focus on the birth, touched the question of Christ's humanity. The fact that God entered the world as a baby was not only sentimental, it was theological. It said, the human body matters, human life matters. God did not stand far away, God came close. In Constantinople, this message was sung with a seriousness that could make even a tired person feel steadier. Still, the empire had its own concerns. Public festivals can stir crowds. Crowds can become unpredictable. Unpredictable crowds make officials nervous. So celebrations were guided, shaped, encouraged to be orderly. Even joy, in an empire, has a schedule. Yet the schedule did not destroy the wonder. It gave it form. People like form. Form helps them return. Imagine leaving a Christmas service in Constantinople. The air outside is cold, the streets are dim, but you carry the sound of chanting in your chest like a small fire. You walk past shops where merchants still sell food and small gifts. You pass a home where a family is gathering, lamps glowing behind curtains. You hear laughter. You smell bread. The city feels like it is holding its breath, not from fear, but from a kind of collective attention. That is what an official feast can do when it works. It makes many separate lives line up for a moment, facing the same direction. And yes, there is bureaucracy behind it. There are decisions about which readings to use. There are questions about fasting before the feast, because the church liked to prepare joy with discipline. There are practical matters about feeding the poor, because a feast that ignores the hungry is not a feast, it is a performance. In Constantinople, charity was a visible part of Christian life, though never perfect, because humans are still humans. The poor knew the season mattered because the season sometimes brought extra bread. That is not poetic, that is real, and real is often more moving than poetic. Back in Oslo, the museum has another object that fits this chapter, a small bronze cross worn smooth from touch. From Constantinople specifically, but it could have been. Someone held it, someone rubbed it between thumb and finger, someone carried it through winter nights, through worries, through loss, through ordinary days. Objects like this do not shout. They whisper. They say, "You are not alone." Christmas in the Imperial Church became a feast that could be celebrated widely, repeatedly, with shared language that helped spread it. It helped spread it. It helped stabilize it. It helped it travel across regions and languages. It also made it harder to change, which is part of why Christmas still feels like a strong shape in the year, even when modern life tries to pull it into 100 directions. But we are not finished. The feast is growing, the story is spreading, and soon the most influential gift giver in Christian imagination will step into view, not as a red-suited icon, but as a bishop from a coastal town, remembered for generosity that was inconveniently quiet. In the next chapter, we will meet Nicholas of Myra, or at least the version of him we can trace with honesty. We will follow how a real person became a legend, how coins became stories, and how winter generosity gained a face that people could recognize across the centuries. For now, let Constantinople hold its steady glow, a city of domes and documents, of arguments and hymns, of power and prayer. In its winter streets, Christmas becomes more than a local custom. It becomes a feast with weight, carried by voices that echo under stone ceilings. And in the dark outside those churches, the same old winter waits, listening. Humans answer with light anyway. Chapter 5. Nicholas of Myra, the patron saint of inconvenient generosity. In the Oslo Museum there is a small leather pouch in a drawer that most visitors never see. It is not dramatic, it does not sparkle. It is the kind of object that becomes important only after you imagine the hand that carried it. Inside are a few old coins, not the famous coins, not the kind you sell at auction with a serious face. Just coins that look tired, like they have been handled by people who had better things to worry about. The pouch exists to teach a simple truth. Money is never only money. Sometimes it is a story folded into metal. Tonight, our story moves to a coastal town called Myra in Lycia, in what is now southern Turkey. In the ancient world, it was part of the Roman Empire. It was not the center of everything, but it was connected. Ships passed nearby. Merchants moved through. News arrived, sometimes late, sometimes exaggerated, always confident. Myra had stone buildings, narrow streets, and the smell of the sea. It had temples, markets, and the usual mix of ordinary lives. People worked, people argued, people got sick, people tried to raise children in a world that offered no guarantees. The winters were not like Oslo winters, but darkness still arrived early enough to make lamps feel precious. Somewhere in this town, in the early centuries of Christianity, lived a bishop named Nicholas. Now here is where the calm drama begins, because Nicholas is both real and not entirely available. He is a historical person, and he is also a legend that has grown large enough to wear many costumes. The record of his life is not as tidy as people would like, because human memory is not a filing cabinet. Human memory is more like a crowded attic where someone keeps adding decorations. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Nicholas was remembered as a bishop of Myra, a leader in the local church, and that he became widely associated with generosity, care for the vulnerable, and quiet help offered without applause. What we cannot do honestly is treat every later story as if it were a verified report. Some tales are clearly shaped by the needs of the people who told them, and yet those tales are still part of the history, because tradition is not only about facts, It is also about what a community chooses to repeat. So, we will walk carefully. We will keep hard foot on the stone floor of history and one foot on the soft rug of legend, and we will try not to trip. Nicholas the Bishop would have lived in a world where being Christian was sometimes normal and sometimes risky, depending on which emperor had opinions that year. Christianity was spreading and organizing. Bishops were not only spiritual leaders, they were community anchors. They settled disputes, they managed charity, they tried to keep people steady in a time that could be unstable. A bishop also had access to resources and networks. This matters because generosity is easier when you have something to give. But generosity is also a choice. You can have resources and still choose to be stingy, which humans often manage with impressive creativity. Nicholas was remembered as someone who chose the other path. The most famous story connected with him is the story of secret gifts. In Nen version, a poor father could not provide dowries for his daughters. The future looked grim. The daughters faced a life of hardship and exploitation, because poverty is rarely polite. Nicholas hears of the situation and does what certain kinds of decent people do. He helps, quietly, without demanding credit. He tosses a pouch of coins into the home by night, sometimes described as through a window, sometimes described as down a chimney, because legends enjoy architectural flair. The coins solve a problem that could have ruined lives, and the help is given in secret, because the goal is relief, not applause. This story may have been shaped over time, but its moral center is clear. Someone with power chose to protect people without turning them into a spectacle. Someone saw a family in trouble and responded with practical mercy. If you have ever received help you did not ask for, you know the strange mixture of emotions it can bring: relief, gratitude, embarrassment, and the uneasy feeling that you now owe the universe something. Secret generosity avoids some of that. It lets the receiver keep dignity. It also makes the giver slightly mysterious, which humans love. The pouch of coins in the museum drawer feels heavier in my mind when I think of that. Not because coins are magical, but because they represent the oldest kind of kindness, the kind that costs something and does not ask for a thank you. Nicholas is also linked to stories of helping sailors. Myra was not far from the sea routes of the Mediterranean. Storms could be sudden, ships could vanish, families could wait for men who did not return. In that world, the sea was both livelihood and threat, so it makes sense that a saint associated with Myra became associated with protection of sailors. In later devotion, Nicholas became a patron for those who travel by sea. People prayed to him when winds rose. People painted his image in places where sailors gathered. It was not superstition in the shallow sense, it was the human need to ask for help when you cannot control the waves. There are also stories about Nicholas helping during famine. Grain shipments mattered. A delayed ship could mean hunger. A bad harvest could mean desperate choices. In some legends, Nicholas intervenes, persuading sailors to share grain destined for another place, with the promise that the loss will be restored. In those stories, the numbers always work out, because miracles are very good at bookkeeping. Whether the details are exact or not, the theme is consistent. Nicholas is remembered as someone who used persuasion, authority, and care to keep people from being crushed by scarcity. And this is where the soft tension of the chapter sits, because winter and scarcity are old companions, and generosity in winter is never a purely sweet story. It is also a story about need, about inequality, about how close a normal life can be to desperation when the harvest fails or sickness arrives. If Nicholas became famous for generosity, it is because many people needed generosity. If he became beloved, it is because the world was not gentle enough on its own. There is another famous thread, the one about Nicholas attending a major church council. Later tradition often places him at the Council of Nicaea, where leaders gathered to debate and define key beliefs. Some versions of the legend include a moment of physical conflict during a theological argument, because humans cannot resist turning ideas into drama. In the early church, debates were intense, and people cared deeply. Nicholas is sometimes remembered as someone who cared enough to be involved. That is enough for now. The details of who did what to whom are less important than the truth that beliefs were being shaped in rooms full of people with strong opinions and tired patience. Now let us return to the real place again, Myra. If you go to the region today, near the modern town of Demre, you find ruins and stones that do not speak, but still suggest. There is an old church associated with Nicholas. There are tombs carved into rock faces nearby, because the ancient world liked to put the dead in places that made a statement. The landscape holds layers. Lycian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and later histories all overlap. It is a reminder that no tradition lives alone. It lives on top of other lives. Nicholas died as people do, and his memory began its long migration. At first, his reputation would have spread regionally. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, pilgrims visited, local devotion grew. Over time, he became known beyond Myra, beyond Lycia, beyond the coastal roads. Saints are portable, which is part of their appeal. You can carry them in prayers and stories, you can borrow them across borders without needing permission. In the Middle Ages, the movement of relics became a major part of how saints travelled, both spiritually and politically. A saint in your city meant prestige, pilgrims, and a sense of protection. It also meant income, but people preferred to say prestige. Nicholas became part of this story when his relics were taken from Myra to Bari in Italy in the 11th century. Bari became a major centre of devotion to St. Nicholas in the west. A basilica was built, pilgrims arrived. The saint who began in a town in Lycia now had a home in a busy Italian port. The sea theme continued, whether anyone planned it or not. From there, Nicholas spread even more widely through Europe. His feast day on December 6 became important in many regions. Children received small gifts. People remembered the generous bishop. Communities staged stories. Traditions grew legs, because traditions always do. And now, if you are feeling the approach of Santa, you are not wrong. But we are not there yet. We are still in the earlier stage, where the figure is not a jolly marketing icon but a bishop with a reputation for quietly solving problems. What makes Nicholas so powerful as a seasonal figure is that his generosity has edges. It is not only sentimental, it is practical, it is inconvenient. It intervenes in situations where the outcomes would be harsh. In other words, Nicholas does not just hand out nice things, he changes trajectories. That is why people kept telling the stories. A winter holiday needs more than decoration. It needs a reason to be kind when kindness feels expensive. It needs a model of care that does not depend on the world being easy. Nicholas offered that model. He also offered a particular style of giving which is secret, direct, and slightly theatrical. A pouch of coins tossed in the night, help delivered without a committee meeting. Relief arriving before pride can interfere too much. If you think about it, this style fits winter perfectly. Winter is the season of closed doors and private homes. It is the season when you notice who is missing. It is the season when you might need help, and also not want anyone to know. A secret gift is a winter kind of gift. Back in Oslo, the museum is still quiet. The evergreen branch from Chapter Ton still sits behind glass, stubbornly green. The idea of light from Chapter 2 still flickers in our minds. The organized feast from Chapter 4 still echoes like chanting under a dome. And now we add something else. We add generosity with a face. This matters because Christmas, as it continues to develop, will become a feast that asks people to think about giving. Giving to family, giving to the poor, giving to strangers, giving as a sign that you understand the story you are celebrating. That is an awkward ask because humans are not always in a giving mood, especially when the days are short and money is tight, and your neighbor insists on playing the same song repeatedly. So the tradition offers a guide. Not a perfect person, not a flawless record, but a figure who represents the kind of help people wish existed when they are afraid. This is the tender irony. Nicholas becomes beloved because he represents a world where someone might notice your need and respond. It is a comforting thought. It is also a quiet critique of a world where too many needs go unnoticed. Still, comfort is allowed. This is bedtime. So let us end with an image. A coastal town, a bishop walking through narrow streets, a household in trouble, a pouch of coins heavy in a hand, a decision made quietly, a step into the night, a gift delivered. No applause, no speeches, only relief. That small act, real or polished by legend, becomes a seed carried across centuries. It will sprout into many customs: shoes filled with treats, stockings by the fire, children waking to surprises, adults pretending they are not moved while being moved anyway. In the next chapter, we will travel north again into the world of Yule, where evergreen, fire, and long night rituals refuse to disappear. We will see how northern winter traditions met Christian feasts and negotiated, sometimes politely, sometimes stubbornly, until the season became the layered thing we recognize today. For now, keep the pouch of coins in mind, not as magic, but as a reminder. The history of Christmas is not only about dates and doctrines, it is also about the simple human choice to make the dark easier for someone else. Chapter 6. Yule arrives with evergreens, fire, and stubborn northern joy. In Oslo, snow has a talent for making everything look honest. It hides the messy parts, it smooths the edges, it turns the city into a quieter version of itself, as if the streets have agreed to speak softly for a while. I step outside the museum for a minute, mostly to remind myself that the world still exists beyond display cases. The air is cold enough to feel clean. The sky is the deep blue-grey of early evening. Across the street, a small church stands with a simple doorway, and a little light spill out. People come and go with careful steps, shoulders slightly raised against the wind. Someone carries a bag that smells like bread. Someone else carries a sprig of pine, as if they are delivering a tiny forest to a kitchen table. This is where Yule belongs in the story. Not as a single thing, not as a neat box, but as a northern answer to the same old winter question: how do we live through the dark and still feel human? The word Yule is old. It shows up in Germanic languages and in the north. It is tied to midwinter celebrations in Scandinavia and northern Europe, and later it becomes woven into the Christian Christmas season in the region. That weaving is not a simple replacement, it is more like braiding. Old strands and new strands pulled together, sometimes neatly, sometimes with knots. If you want to understand why this happened, you have to remember what winter is like up here. In the far north, winter is not cute. It is not a background for shopping, it is a condition of life. In older Scandinavian communities, winter was the season of household endurance. People relied on stored food. They relied on good timing. They relied on each other. Farms and villages became small worlds. Travel could be difficult. Darkness could be heavy. The wind could make the landscape feel endless and empty. So people created a counterweight. They held feasts. They marked the turning of the year. They honored gods and ancestors. They told stories that made the world feel less random. Yule was part of that. A midwinter feast time, tied to community, to ritual, to food, to drink, to fire, and to the steady insistence that life was still worth celebrating even when the sun seemed to have wandered off. In the museum there is a wooden bowl blackened slightly on the bottom, the kind that has sat near a hearth for years. There is also a simple iron hook, used for hanging a pot over a fire. These are not glamorous objects. They are the skeleton of winter life, and that life shaped the celebrations. Fire was central. In a northern winter, the fire is not decoration. It is the difference between comfort and danger. It is also the heart of the home, the place where people gather, the place where stories live. When people talk about the Yule log, they are talking about more than a chunk of wood. They are talking about continuity. Feed the fire, feed the household, keep the light alive. Now imagine a longhouse in Norway, or in Sweden, or in Denmark, or in Iceland later on. Imagine thick timber walls, smoke rising, a roof built to hold up against snow and wind. Inside, people sit close, not because they are all best friends, but because heat is a valuable resource. There is food on the table, and in midwinter the food matters even more because it proves you planned well. The feast would include meat, often from animals that could not be easily kept through the winter, and preserved foods and bread, and whatever the household had saved. There would be ale, because fermentation is one of humanity's oldest ways of telling winter that it does not own the mood. People would drink and talk and sing, not always beautifully, but sincerely. Some of these feasts were tied to religious rites in the pre-Christian Norse world. People made offerings. They spoke to gods associated with fertility, harvest, protection, and the turning of the year. They honored Odin in some traditions, and other gods depending on region and time. They asked for luck. They asked for peace in the household. They asked for good weather. They asked for the return of the sun, or at least the return of longer days. The rituals could include toasts, called by different names in different sources, where people dedicated drinks to gods and ancestors. It was social and spiritual at the same time, which is usually how it works when a community has to face winter together. There was also an ancestor thread. Midwinter can make people feel close to those who are gone. The dark has a way of making memory louder. So honoring ancestors makes sense. You remember who built the house. You remember who taught you how to store grain. You remember who did not make it through past winters. You speak their names. You keep them near. This is not gloomy, it is grounding. It says we are part of a line and the line continues. And then there are the evergreens again. Of course there are. Evergreen branches appear in many winter traditions because they are the most cooperative plant in the season. You can bring them inside. They smell like life. They stay green. They do not demand much from you. They sit there and make the room feel less bare. People used greenery for protection and blessing. Branches above doors, greenery around the hearth. Sometimes it is described as keeping harmful forces away. Sometimes it is simply a sign that the household is awake and cared for. Sometimes it is a way of inviting the returning light. Sometimes it is just because it looks good, and humans have always been allowed to like beauty. If you think of a northern home in midwinter, the interior can be dark. Oil lamps are small, firelight flickers, shadows move. In that light, a green branch is a quiet statement. The world is not dead, it is sleeping. We are waiting. Now comes the soft tension. The North does not stay isolated. Christianity spreads into Scandinavia over time through missionaries, trade, political alliances, and the slow pull of larger European networks. Kings and chieftains take new beliefs for many reasons, some spiritual, some strategic, some both. Communities shift gradually. Old practices do not vanish overnight. They adapt. They hide in plain sight. They get renamed. They move into new holidays. This is where Yule meets Christmas. Christianity brought its own calendar of feasts, including Christmas. It brought churches and priests and new stories. It brought new rituals, new moral frameworks, and the idea that midwinter was now not only about the turning of the year, but about the birth of Jesus. The meeting could be peaceful, and it could also be tense. Some people embraced the new faith, some resisted. Some blended practices. Some did the outward rituals for political safety while keeping older beliefs in private, and some simply continued doing what had always worked in winter, because no theology can change the fact that you still need food and fire. So what happens when a new feast arrives in a season already crowded with meaning? It borrows shapes that people already understand. Feasting remains, because winter still demands it, and because communities still need the social glue. Gift-giving grows in some areas, sometimes linked to St. Nicholas later, sometimes linked to local customs. Candlelight becomes central, because Christianity already loves the symbolism of light, and the North already loves actual light. Songs and storytelling remain, because humans do not stop needing stories just because a new story becomes official. And Yule remains, often as a word, and often as a mood. In Norwegian, you still say Yule for Christmas. In Swedish, Jul. In Danish, Jul. In Icelandic, Jol. The old word survives inside the newer feast. That is not an accident. That is culture doing what culture does. It keeps what fits. If you want a concrete example of how blending works, think about the idea of a midwinter feast with ale. Christian authorities often tried to guide drinking habits, with varying success, because winter feasts and alcohol are not easily separated in northern tradition. Over time, some older toasting practices may have been redirected toward Christian themes, toward saints, toward blessings for the household. The form remains. The dedication shifts. The human need underneath stays the same. Another example is the evergreen. Christianity did not invent bringing green branches indoors, but it could reinterpret them. Green could represent life, renewal, the promise of spring, or eternal life. People could keep the branch and give it a new story. Or they could keep the branch and not worry too much about the story. Both options happened, because people are varied like that. The calm sarcasm of history is that people often think they are choosing between old and new, when they are actually building a third thing that is partly both. Then their grandchildren call it tradition and argue about it as if it has always been exactly this way. Yule also carried a sense of communal obligation. In older rural societies, winter survival depended on neighbours, so midwinter was a time when generosity mattered, not only as virtue but as practicality. If a household struggled, the village might feel it. So there were norms around sharing food, offering hospitality, and maintaining bonds. Those norms fit well with Christian teachings about charity and care. Again, not a clean replacement, but an overlap. Now, let us walk northward in the mind again through real places. Picture western Norway, with fjords dark and deep, mountains rising, snowline creeping down. Picture farms tucked into valleys, smoke rising from roofs. Picture coastal community where fishing continues as long as weather allows, and people watch the sea with the kind of attention sailors have always had. Picture inland forests in Sweden where winter can feel endless, and where the sound of trees in wind becomes part of the household soundtrack. Picture Denmark with its flatter landscape and strong winds, where the sea is never far from the conversation. Picture northern Germany where Germanic winter traditions also lived, with their own feasts and greenery and rituals. Across these regions, winter celebration carried the same basic ingredients: food, drink, fire, light, song, and a shared agreement to hold together. When Christianity arrived and Christmas took root, the season gained a new central story. But the older ingredients stayed because they were not decoration. They were survival turned into ritual. This is the part I find most humane. People did not abandon their winter joys easily. They had earned them. They had kept themselves alive through them. So even when new beliefs arrived, people kept the practices that helped them endure. And the church in many cases understood that it was wiser to guide than to erase. Not always, and not everywhere. Some leaders were strict. Some were practical. But over time, many communities found a way to let old and new share the same winter room. So Yule becomes the northern flavour of Christmas. A season with long nights, warm interiors, candlelight, evergreen scent, and the deep cultural instinct to make the home a refuge. If you have ever sat in a Norwegian home in December with candles lit, coffee on the table, and a quiet sense that everyone is trying to be gentle with one another, you are feeling the long echo of this history. It is not only modern coziness, it is old survival wisdom wearing a softer sweater. Back in Oslo, I return inside the museum. The hallway is warm. The glass cases glow gently. The evergreen sprig in its case looks almost smug, as if it knows it will outlast every argument. And that is the final point of this chapter. The evergreen stays because it is practical. It stays green in winter, it is easy to gather, it smells good, it makes the room feel alive. You can hang it, braid it, place it, decorate it, bless it, or ignore it while still enjoying it. It does not ask your permission to work as a symbol. It just does. So when Yule meets Christmas, and when northern winters shape the feast, the evergreen becomes a bridge, a small piece of the outdoors that can live indoors, a reminder that life continues, a quiet promise that the light will return, whether quickly or slowly. In the next chapter we will move into medieval Europe, where Christmas becomes more public, more theatrical, and more tangled with markets and music. We will see mangers, carols, and the early shape of the Christmas season as a community event, with all the charm and crowd management that implies. For now, keep the fire burning in your imagination. Keep the evergreen near the doorway. Keep the sense that winter is heavy, and humans are allowed to answer with warmth. Chapter 7. Medieval Europe markets mangers and organised wonder. Medieval winter has a particular sound. It is not the sound of silence, because medieval life is never truly silent. It is the sound of wind moving through narrow streets, the sound of boots on wet stone, the sound of a church bell that does not care if you are tired, the sound of a market waking up even when the daylight is weak and short. If Rome gave us loud festivals and Constantinople gave us organized feast days, the medieval period gives us something else. It gives us repetition. It gives us habit. It gives us the slow turning of Christmas from a feast on a calendar into a season that shapes whole communities. By the Middle Ages, Christianity is deeply rooted across much of Europe. The church calendar is a central structure of time. People know the year by its feast days and fasts. They do not need a printed planner. The bells tell them what day it is. The rituals tell them what kind of day it is. The food tells them what season they are in. Christmas sits inside a wider rhythm. Advent leads up to it, a time of waiting and preparation. In many places, Advent carries a sense of restraint, with fasting or simpler meals, because humans like to build anticipation by making life slightly harder. Then Christmas arrives with the release, with feasting, with singing, with warmth. This structure matters. It turns the feast into a journey. It gives the season soft tension without needing any dramatic villains. The tension is simply waiting. The human condition in a calendar. In a medieval town, the church is not only a place of worship, it is a community anchor. It is where people gather, where announcements are heard, where disputes are sometimes mediated, where the poor can receive aid, where the dead are remembered, where everyone is reminded that life is short and should be taken seriously, except at the moments when joy is allowed. Christmas is one of those allowed moments, and medieval Europe makes it visible. Imagine a town in England, or in France, or in the German lands, or in Italy. Cobblestone streets, timber-framed houses, smoke rising from chimneys, animals in pens near homes, people wrapped in wool, a river nearby moving slowly under a grey sky. The market square is busy because winter does not cancel commerce, it just makes commerce wear thicker clothes. Merchants sell winter foods, preserved fish, salted meat, cheese, dried fruit, nuts, bread, spices if you have money and the right connections, because spices travel and they remind people that the world is larger than their muddy street. Candles are sold because everyone wants more light. Sometimes greenery is sold. Sometimes people gather their own from nearby woods if they can. This is the season when the church and the market begin to share the same air. Not in a cynical way, at least not always, but in an honest way. The feast has spiritual meaning, and it also has practical needs. People will gather, people will eat, people will travel, people will buy. The economy follows the calendar, and the calendar follows the human need to be together. This is also the era where Christmas storytelling becomes more theatrical. The nativity story lends itself to performance because it has characters and movement. Mary and Joseph, the child, shepherds, angels, magi, a star, a jealous ruler in the background, which we will keep in the background because we are staying calm and bedtime safe. Medieval communities told these stories through plays, processions, songs, and staged scenes. Not everyone could read, so the church used visual and auditory storytelling, carvings, paintings, stained glass, dramatic reenactments. The goal was not only to entertain, it was to teach and to invite people into the meaning of the feast. One important development is the use of nativity scenes and living nativity plays. The exact origins vary, but by the later medieval period, creating a manger scene becomes a way for people to experience the story with their senses. Straw, animals, a small cradle, the calm image of a newborn in a place that looks humble enough to be believable. This is powerful because it translates theology into something you can picture. It says, the sacred is not only in the sky, the sacred is on the ground, in a stable, among ordinary sounds. Now, about carols. Christmas music grows through the Middle Ages in different forms. Some songs are liturgical, sung in Latin in church. Some are more popular songs in local languages, sung in streets and homes. These songs carry stories, emotions, and seasonal atmosphere. They also carry community, because singing together is one of the easiest ways to feel less alone in winter. When people sing together, they breathe together. Their nervous systems synchronize a little. They feel, for a moment, like a single body. That is why music is such a reliable winter medicine. But medieval Christmas is not only gentle and sacred, it also has a playful side, sometimes a very playful side. There were traditions of misrule where social roles could be inverted in a controlled way. You can see echoes of Saturnalia in this, Feast of Fools in some places, or other local customs where lower-ranking clergy or students might stage a playful inversion. No everywhere, not always approved, but it appeared often enough to show a pattern. Humans keep reinventing the idea that winter needs a release valve. The Church sometimes tolerated these customs, sometimes condemned them, sometimes tried to guide them into safer channels. This is a theme that will continue. People do not easily give up their seasonal silliness. Institutions do not easily embrace silliness without supervision. The compromise is tradition. Another medieval Christmas feature is hospitality. The season emphasized welcoming travelers, feeding the poor, and sharing resources. Not because everyone was naturally kind, but because Christianity taught charity as a duty, and because winter made need obvious. A hungry person in winter is not abstract. They are in your doorway. So almsgiving increased. Some churches and monasteries distributed food. Wealth households might open their doors for certain meals. Guilds sometimes organized support. Again, not perfect, not universal, but present enough to matter. This is where St. Nicholas customs also begin to spread in parts of Europe, especially as his devotion grows in the West. His feast day in early December becomes a time for small gifts, especially for children. This is not yet modern Santa, but it is one of the roots of that later figure. Medieval Europe is building a toolbox of seasonal practices, and Nicholas is one of the most useful tools because he combines generosity with story. Now, because we are in the medieval world, we must include one more important piece: the 12 days. In many traditions, Christmas is not one day, it is a span. The period from Christmas to Epiphany becomes a festive season. People feast, visit, sing, and rest when possible. This makes sense. If you are going to do all this work and cooking and singing, might as well stretch it. Also, in winter, time feels slow. A longer festival fills the dark. The 12 days also created a sense of liminal time, a space between years, when normal routines could soften. It is that pocket in the calendar again, that little room where people behave differently, and now the market side again. As Christmas becomes more established, towns and cities begin to develop seasonal markets and fairs. These were not exactly like modern Christmas markets with decorative lights, but the basic idea is familiar. People gather to buy goods connected with winter and the feast. Food, candles, cloth, small gifts. The marketplace becomes part of the holiday atmosphere. Commerce and celebration mingle. They do not always agree on boundaries. Here is the soft tension that lives in this chapter. Christmas in medieval Europe becomes both holy and social, both spiritual and economic, both solemn and playful. That mixture is unstable, and it creates friction. Some clergy emphasize reverence and restraint, especially around the sacred meaning of the Nativity. Some communities emphasize the joy, the feasting, the social release. Some leaders worry about excess, about drinking, about disorder. Some ordinary people worry about being judged. Some merchants quietly love the season because it makes people spend. Some poor families quietly dread the season because it makes their lack more visible. This is not new, it is the same tension we feel now, only with different clothing and fewer electric decorations. Still, in the middle of these competing pressures, the season creates real comfort. For many people, the Christmas period brings warmth, food, music, and a sense of shared story. Even the poor might receive extra charity. Even the lonely might find a gathering. Even the tired might hear a familiar song and feel, for a moment, steadier. Imagine a medieval church on Christmas Eve. The building is cold, but the candles soften it. People breathe in the same air. The sound of singing rises. The nativity story is read. Perhaps a small scene is displayed near the altar. People think about Mary and Joseph, about the child, about the angels, about the shepherds. People think about their own children. People think about the fragile goodness of life. Then the service ends, and everyone steps back into the night. The town is darker than our modern towns, but the darkness is not empty. It is full of small lights, lamps in windows, torches on the street, a fire in a hearth behind a door. Someone walks home carrying a piece of bread. Someone carries a small gift. Someone carries nothing but the sound of the hymn. Back in Oslo, in our quiet museum, the medieval section has an old carved figure of Mary, hands worn smooth where generations touched the wood. People touch objects when they want to feel close to a story. They do it without thinking. They do it because hands remember what hearts need. That is medieval Christmas at its best. Organized wonder, shared story. A calendar that makes the community breathe together. In the next chapter, the tone will shift. We will enter the Reformation era, where some people decide that Christmas has become too much, too messy, too entangled with old customs and too much fun, which is always suspicious to certain personalities. We will see attempts to cancel Christmas, and we will watch Christmas refuse, quietly but stubbornly, to stay cancelled. For now, let the medieval town settle into sleep. The market stalls close, the last candle burns low, the church bell rests, the night holds the streets. Inside homes, people eat what they can, share what they have, and tell the old story again, because winter still asks, and humans still answer. Chapter 8. The Reformation cancels the party, and the party refuses to stay cancelled. There is a plain wooden table in the museum that looks like it was built by someone who did not trust decoration. It is sturdy, it is practical, it has the personality of a lecture about self-control. When I stand near it, I always think of the Reformation, because the Reformation had many complex causes and deep spiritual themes, but it also had a very simple mood at times. Please stop enjoying yourselves incorrectly. That mood is important for the history of Christmas, because Christmas in medieval Europe had grown into a season with layers. Church services, yes, but also feasting, music, plays, markets, greenery, and a calendar pocket where people relaxed their normal rules. To some reformers, this looked less like devotion and more like a festival that had wandered off and never returned. So the question became sharp. What is Christmas supposed to be? The Reformation was not event in place. It was a long period of religious change across Europe, shaped by theology, politics, printing, economics, and ordinary human frustration. Martin Luther in Wittenberg is a central name, of course. His criticisms of church practices and his emphasis on scripture and grace helped spark major shifts in the early 1600s. But the Reformation spread in different directions, with different leaders and different outcomes in different regions. In some places, Christmas continued with new emphasis. In others, Christmas became suspicious. The suspicion was not only about the birth of Jesus. Most Christians, reformers included, did not object to the idea of the Nativity itself. The suspicion was about the habits that had grown around it. Saints' days, processions, plays, certain kinds of music, certain kinds of decoration, certain kinds of drinking, certain kinds of role inversion and public mischief. To reform-minded leaders, these felt like leftovers from older customs, or like distractions from true worship, or like invitations to disorder. And disorder was frightening in a time when societies were already tense. So in some Protestant regions, the calendar changed. Feast days were reduced, saints were pushed aside, images were removed from churches in some areas, the worship style became more focused on preaching and scripture, the mood turned plainer, at least in public. This did not automatically erase Christmas, but it did reshape it. In Lutheran areas, for example, Christmas remained important. Luther himself valued music and family devotion. Over time, traditions like the Christmas tree grew in the German-speaking world, though that story takes time and will bloom later. The point is that the Reformation did not have one opinion. It had many. But in the Reformed tradition, especially in parts of Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scotland, and among English Puritans, the suspicion of Christmas became more intense. The argument went something like this, spoken calmly with a stern face. Where is it commanded in Scripture? If the answer was not clear, then the feast was treated as a human invention at best, and at worst a doorway for superstition and chaos. And because Christmas had become a big social event, the chaos part was not hard to find. In England, this tension grew over time. The Church of England separated from Rome under Henry VIII for reasons that were not entirely about Christmas. Later, under different rulers, the Church swung between more Protestant and more traditional styles. Those swings were not abstract. They shaped what people could do in public, what services looked like, and which customs were tolerated. By the time you reach the mid-1600s, England is in a period of severe political and religious strain. Parliament and the monarchy are in conflict, communities are divided, sermons carry political weight. The nation is tired and sharp-edged. In that environment, the Puritans gained more influence. Puritans wanted a further reform of the Church of England. They valued simpler worship, strict Sabbath-keeping, and moral discipline. They also tended to distrust holidays that looked like excuses for excess. Christmas, unfortunately for Christmas, looked exactly like that. In the 1640s, the English Parliament began to restrict or discourage Christmas celebrations. A key moment comes in 1647 when Parliament passed an ordinance that abolished the feasts of Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, replacing them with regular fast days and ordinary worship. The reasoning was framed as a desire to remove unbiblical festivals and the disorder associated with them. This was the official attempt to cancel the party. Now, if you have met humans, you can probably guess what happened next. Many people did not cooperate. In London and other towns, Christmas had been a long-established season of gatherings, food, and familiar customs. Removing it was not just a theological adjustment. It felt like someone trying to take away a piece of the year that helped people endure winter. It felt personal, so there was resistance. Some people kept celebrating quietly at home, some shopkeepers opened as usual, because the new rules wanted Christmas to be a normal workday, but others closed in defiance. In some places there were protests and unrest, because when you push on a tradition that lives in the body pushes back. This is the soft tension that becomes real tension. Not dramatic in the bedtime sense, but real in the historical sense. When authorities try to reshape time itself, people notice. The Puritan viewpoint was not only about stopping fun, it was about sincerity. Puritans worried that people used holidays as covers for shallow religion, social disorder, and poor behavior. They wanted faith to be steady, not seasonal. They wanted worship to be rooted in scripture, not in inherited custom. They feared that the old festivals kept pulling people back toward practices they considered wrong. There is a certain moral logic there, even if it comes with the warmth of a stone floor, but there is also a human cost. Winter is hard. People need joy. People need permission to rest. People need a shared moment where the village or the city block feels like a community instead of a collection of separate struggles. Christmas had become that moment for many. So when it was officially suppressed, it did not vanish. It went underground in places. It became quieter. It shifted into private spaces. It waited. In Scotland, the story has its own shape. The Scottish Reformation led to a church that was strongly influenced by Reformed ideas. Christmas was not embraced in the same way it was in some other places. In parts of Scotland, Christmas was treated as an ordinary day for a long time, with the focus placed instead on the Sabbath and on other approved forms of worship. The cultural result was that Christmas customs were less central, at least publicly, for generations. This difference is important. It shows that Christmas is not inevitable in its familiar form. It is a tradition shaped by choices, by power, by theology, and by local habits. Meanwhile, in England, the political winds changed again. The monarchy was restored in 1660, and with it the public celebration of Christmas returned. Not because every debate was solved, but because the people who had tried to enforce the ban lost control. And here is the small sarcastic lesson of history. You can ban a feast on paper, you cannot easily ban it from people's kitchens. Even when official policy tries to flatten the season, people keep small practices. A special meal, a candle, a visit, a song, a bit of greenery, a gift for a child. Not always loudly, not always safely, but quietly, because winter traditions are often carried in silence as much as in crowds. There is also the New World echo, because English Puritans carried their suspicion of Christmas across the Atlantic. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Christmas was discouraged, and at one point legally restricted in the mid-1600s. The reasoning was similar. Unbiblical, disorderly, too much like older festivals, too much like an excuse. Again, people did not all cooperate. Again, the tradition bent rather than breaking. So what did this era do to the history of Christmas? It narrowed Christmas in some places, pushing it toward church worship and family devotion rather than public carnival. It reduced certain medieval customs, made some communities wary of decoration and theatre. It emphasized sobriety and scripture. It also created a counterforce. When Christmas returned, it did not return as exactly the same thing. It returned with a sense of recovery, sometimes with renewed enthusiasm. People remember what they are told they cannot have. Sometimes they remember it with affection. Sometimes they remember it with stubbornness. And the season continued to evolve. In some regions, the focus shifted toward the home. Family gatherings became more central. Private devotion, reading, and household rituals grew. This was not only because of the Reformation, it was also because societies were changing. But the Reformation period helped push Christmas toward a quieter centre in many Protestant contexts. This is a key bridge toward the later Victorian Christmas, where the home becomes the main stage and the season becomes a performance of warmth, family, charity, and cozy moral feeling. That is the next chapter, and it will include literature, sentiment, and the invention of many things people now insist are ancient. But before we get there, let us sit for a moment with this strange winter scene. A church interior stripped of certain images, plain and focused. A preacher speaking seriously about devotion and discipline. A town street where some shops open as usual on December 25. A household where a family quietly shares a better meal than normal, but does not make noise about it. A child asking why today feels different. A parent answering with a careful voice, and somewhere, always somewhere, a candle lit anyway. Because even when the official mood is strict, winter still presses against the windows, darkness still arrives early, people still need light, people still need a story, people still need one another. The Reformation did not destroy Christmas. It challenged Christmas. It questioned Christmas. It forced Christmas to justify itself. It made Christmas change shape in some places, and in other places it made Christmas dig in its heels. This is what makes the history of Christmas so durable. It is not one fragile tradition. It is a bundle of human needs wrapped in seasonal habits. You can cut one strand, and the bundle on it did not say that, sorry. You can cut one strand, and the rest still holds. In the next chapter, we will step into the 19th century, especially in England, where Christmas is rebuilt as a cozy moral season, powered by industry, urban life, and the persuasive force of a good story. We will meet Charles Dickens and the cultural reboot that made Christmas feel warm even when the streets were cold. For now, let the plain wooden table in the museum stand as a symbol of this chapter. Sturdy, practical, a little severe, not without purpose, but not enough on its own to carry a winter heart. Chapter 9. Victorian Christmas. If you ever want to see a culture redesign a holiday without admitting it is redesigning a holiday, you go to Victorian England. You walk through the fog, you listen to the coal smoke in the air, you watch the city hurry, and you notice that, somehow, Christmas starts feeling like a warm living room even when the streets are cold enough to argue with your bones. The 19th century is busy. It is the century of factories and railways and crowded cities. People move from rural places into urban neighborhoods where the sky is often the color of used paper. Work is louder, longer, and less forgiving. Time is measured more strictly. Money matters more visibly. Poverty is harder to ignore because it is right there on the pavement, next to the shop window full of things you cannot afford. In that world, Christmas does something interesting. It becomes a season that promises softness. It becomes a ritual that tries to make industrial life feel human for a few days. Not always successfully, but with persistence. This is not only about religion. Many Victorians were sincerely religious, yes, but the Christmas reboot is also about social life, family life, and the new reality that people want a holiday that can survive in a modern economy. People want warmth with a schedule. People want moral feeling that fits into a work week. People want a tradition that can be repeated, photographed in the mind, and sold in a shop without looking too shameless. So Christmas leans toward the home. The medieval church-centered season and the rowdy street customs had already been trimmed in many places by the Reformation and by changing social norms. Now the Victorian age turns the home into the main stage. The family becomes the central audience. The child becomes the central symbol. The hearth becomes a kind of altar, with food and candlelight and a sense that everyone is supposed to be kind now, even if they were not kind in November. If you are wondering why this feels familiar, it is because this is where many modern Christmas expectations become firm, not invented from nothing, but made louder, more standardized, and more widely shared. London plays a major role in this because London is a machine that produces culture as well as smoke. People crowd into shops, newspapers circulate, books become more available, the postal system becomes more efficient. Railways move people across the country in ways that make family visits more possible. Suddenly, you can travel to see relatives in a time frame that does not require a full expedition plan. And when travel becomes easier, Christmas becomes more about going home. Cards are part of this too. The Victorian era sees the rise of Christmas cards as a popular custom. A simple piece of printed paper becomes a way to send seasonal goodwill across distance. It is a small thing, but small things scale. When 1 million people do a small thing, it starts to feel like the natural order of the universe. Christmas also becomes more decorated, not only in churches but in homes. Greenery returns strongly. Holly, ivy, mistletoe, the old evergreen impulse never left, and now it gets a cozy spotlight. People hang greenery because it looks alive, and because it smells like winter forests, and because it makes a room feel less tired. And then the tree. The Christmas tree becomes more popular and visible in Britain during the 19th century. The custom has roots in German-speaking regions, and it becomes fashionable in Britain partly through the influence of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Albert was from a German duchy, and the image of the royal family with a decorated tree helped spread the idea that a tree in the home was the correct kind of winter behaviour. People copy royalty when they want to feel respectable. People also copy royalty when they want an excuse to bring a tree indoors and hang shiny things on it. The tree is perfect for the Victorian mood. It is domestic, it is sentimental, it is visually dramatic in a polite way. It also creates a structured space for gifts, which is very convenient for anyone trying to manage children in late December. Now we arrive at the most influential Victorian contribution to Christmas, which is not a decoration, but a story. Charles Dickens publishes A Christmas Carol in the early 1840s. The year is 1843. It is a short book with a long shadow. It does not create Christmas by itself, but it helps set the emotional temperature of the season. Dickens lived in a time when poverty was widespread and often treated as a moral failing rather than a social problem. Workhouses existed, child labour was common, the gap between wealth and need was sharp. Many people were tired and angry, and many wealthy people preferred not to be interrupted by the sight of suffering. Dickens, with his gift for vivid characters and moral drama, writes a winter tale that pushes directly on this tension. The story centres on a hard-hearted businessman, Ebenezer Scrooge, who treats other people like inconveniences. He is not a villain with a cape. He is worse than that. He is ordinary. He is the kind of person who can exist in any era, including ours, and still believe he is being sensible. Then the story does what a good winter story often does. It brings visitors. In Dickens, these visitors are spirits who show Scrooge scenes from his life and from the lives around him. The purpose is not to frighten him for entertainment. The purpose is to wake him up. It is a moral intervention wrapped in a ghost story coat, because sometimes people listen better when the lights are low. For bedtime purposes, we will keep it gentle. Think of it as a guided tour through memory, regret, and consequence, conducted by very persistent seasonal educators. The emotional core is simple. Scrooge sees what his coldness does. He sees what his isolation costs. He sees the fragile goodness of ordinary families who do not have much, but still share warmth. He sees a child who is unwell, and he understands that indifference has weight. And then, in the final movement, he changes. He becomes generous. He becomes kinder. He becomes involved. He turns outward toward community. He becomes the kind of person who would bring extra food to a neighbor in winter, without making it a performance. This is why the story lands. It offers redemption without pretending life is easy. It acknowledges hardship and still insists that kindness is possible. It suggests that Christmas is a time when people should notice at another, especially the ones who are easy to ignore. Dickens also gives Christmas a language: merry, bright, warm, familial, charitable. Not perfect, not always honest, but emotionally powerful. Once a culture learns that language, it keeps using it. The Victorian period also builds the idea of Christmas as a season of charity more broadly. Not only private generosity, but organized giving, public appeals, philanthropic events, donations. The poor become part of the Christmas imagination, sometimes respectfully, sometimes in a way that turns poverty into a backdrop for other people's moral feelings. This is the shadow side. Charity can be real help. Charity can also be a way for the comfortable to feel comfortable. The soft tension of Victorian Christmas is exactly this. The season is cozy and the society is not. Factories still run, workers still struggle, children still labour, cities still choke on smoke. But in the middle of it, the holiday says, for a little while, we will act as if the world could be gentler. We will eat together, we will sing, we will give gifts, we will visit, we will gather around a tree. We will light candles. We will tell stories about compassion. That gap between the ideal and the reality creates both hope and pressure. Hope, because people truly do become kinder sometimes. Pressure, because people are expected to feel warm and grateful even when their life is not warm and not safe. You can see this in the way Christmas becomes more focused on children. The Victorian era strengthens the idea of childhood as a special, protected stage of life, at least in the ideal. The reality for many working-class children was still harsh. But the cultural ideal grows. Christmas becomes a day for children to receive gifts, to be surprised, to feel wonder. Adults begin to perform wonder for them. Adults pretend they are not tired. Adults do the work of magic. This is touching, and it is also labour, often done by mothers and household managers who have enough on their plate already. The holiday says peace on earth, and the kitchen says please wash your hands and stop touching the decorations. Caroling also fits here. Some older songs and traditions continue, but the Victorian age helps shape carol as a seasonal activity that feels communal and cheerful. Groups sing, neighbours open doors, the street becomes friendlier for a moment. Even if the singing is not perfect, it is the attempt that matters. In winter, a shared song can be a lantern. At the same time, the figure of Santa begins to move toward the modern version, especially in the English-speaking world. We will talk more about the modern global spread in the next chapter, but the Victorian era sets the stage. Gift-giving becomes more formalized. The tree provides a place for presents. The home becomes the theatre for surprise. The season becomes a system. And here is the slightly sarcastic Victorian detail that deserves a gentle smile. Many customs that feel ancient today were made popular, standardized, or reshaped during this period. People then looked back and said, "We have always done it this way," which is the most traditional sentence a human can produce. By the end of the 19th century, Christmas in Britain, and in many places influenced by British culture, is a powerful blend. Christian feast, family holiday, market season, charity story, child-centered wonder, candlelight and greenery. A tree in the corner like a small indoor forest with ambitions. It is not pure, it is not simple, but it works, which is why it lasts. Back in Oslo, the museum has a small printed card from the 19th century, the kind with a winter scene and a seasonal greeting. The paper is thin, the ink is faded, but the intent is clear. Someone wanted to reach across distance and say, "I remember you in the dark season." That is the heart of this chapter. Victorian Christmas teaches the modern world to imagine the holiday as a message you send, a mood you build, and a kindness you practice, at least for a little while. In the next chapter, we will move into the modern era, where Christmas travels globally through media, advertising, migration, and local adaptation. We will see how the holiday becomes louder, brighter, and sometimes more commercial than anyone asked for. We will also see how, under all that, the old winter need still remains: light, warmth, gathering, story. For now, let the Victorian street fade into quiet. The fog softens the lamps, the shop windows dim. The last carol of the night drifts away. Inside a home, a fire burns low. A child sleeps. An adult finally sits down. The tree glows faintly. Outside, winter continues. Inside, the season insists on gentleness. Chapter 10. The modern global Christmas, bright, loud, and still secretly about the dark. Oslo in December has a certain polite glow. The streets are lined with lights that try very hard. The shops play music that insists it is cheerful. People carry bags and obligations. Someone is always late, and someone is always pretending they are not late. The city looks beautiful, and underneath the beauty you can feel the quiet arithmetic of the season. How much time is left? How many things remain? Who still needs a gift? Who will be alone? Who will be missed? Who will be too tired to enjoy any of it? Modern Christmas is like that. It is warm and bright, and it is also full of soft pressure. It is a season that claims to be about peace, while gently asking you to move faster. And yet the reason it survives all this is simple. The old winter question has not changed. How will you carry the dark? By the 20th century, Christmas had already become a powerful blend of Christian feast, family holiday, and cultural season in many parts of Europe and North America. What changes in the modern era is the speed and reach of the season. The holiday becomes global not only through religion and tradition, but through media, commerce, and migration. Stories travel faster than ships now. Images travel faster than stories. Music travels fastest of all. You can hear a song from across the world while standing in a supermarket aisle, deciding between two kinds of cookies you did not need until the song told you it was time. This is how Christmas spreads. Not by force usually, but by repetition. In the United States, Christmas becomes tightly connected to department stores, advertising, and the rise of a consumer economy that understands an important truth. People will spend more when they feel emotional. Department stores in big cities become part of the holiday experience. Window displays are not only decoration, they are theatre. People gather to look. Children press their hands to the glass. Adults pretend they are only walking by, as if wonder is not allowed past a certain age. Inside, there are gifts arranged in ways that suggest your love can be measured by how shiny a box is. Seasonal advertising grows. The language of Christmas becomes a kind of shared script. Warmth, togetherness, joy, family, kindness, and also quietly buy now. The soft tension of modern Christmas is this. The season invites people to care, and the system invites people to purchase. Sometimes those invitations overlap nicely, sometimes they step on each other. If you have ever felt genuinely moved while also feeling slightly manipulated, you are not alone. That feeling is practically a modern carol. Media builds the season even more. Radio spreads Christmas music widely. Recordings standardize songs so that the same melodies repeat from one end of a country to another. Films and television create shared Christmas stories, often centered on family, redemption, romance, or nostalgia. The plots are usually predictable, because winter asks for predictability when everything else feels uncertain. Someone is grumpy, then becomes kinder. Someone is lonely, then finds connection. Someone is stressed, then remembers what matters. Someone learns that the best gift was never the expensive thing, even though the expensive thing still appears in the background. It is comforting because it is familiar. Familiar is a kind of light. At the same time, Christmas becomes more visually consistent. Trees, lights, wrapping paper, gift exchanges, festive meals. The season begins to look similar across regions that once had more distinct local customs. Identical but closer. This is what global culture does. It creates shared symbols that can fit into many places. It also creates a sense that there is a correct way to celebrate, which is a stressful idea for anyone who cannot afford the correct way, or does not want the correct way, or is simply too tired to perform joy on schedule. Still, the symbols are popular for a reason. They work. The tree is a good example. By the 20th century, the Christmas tree becomes widespread across many countries that adopt the modern celebration. It is easy to understand. It turns a corner of a room into a small seasonal stage. It gives children a focus. It gives adults a project. It lets people hang lights in a way that feels meaningful instead of purely practical. And lights themselves become the new candle. Electric lights are one of the biggest shifts in winter life. Once streets and homes can be brightly lit, the darkness is less physically dangerous. But the emotional weight of winter does not vanish just because you can turn on a lamp. In some ways, the bright lights make the emotional shadows more obvious. People notice what is missing more clearly. So the season doubles down on light as symbol. Strings of lights on trees and windows, lights across streets, illuminated stars, glowing decorations that suggest the world can be softened through design. Sometimes it works, sometimes it is just very bright. Both can be true. Now we widen our view beyond Europe and North America. Christmas becomes a global holiday through many channels. Christian missionary history plays a role in some places, colonial history plays a role, migration plays a role, international business plays a role, media plays a role, tourism plays a role. Global supply chains play a role because it is hard to ignore a season when it arrives in shipping containers and storefront displays. In many countries where Christianity is a major faith, Christmas develops both religious and cultural forms. In some places it is deeply church-centered, in others it is more home-centered, in others it is both. In countries where Christianity is not the majority faith, Christmas is often adopted as a cultural season rather than a religious baup. People enjoy the lights, the music, the seasonal foods, and the gift-giving. The holiday becomes a winter festival, sometimes romantic, sometimes playful, sometimes focused on children, sometimes focused on social gatherings. This is not fake Christmas. This is Christmas doing what it has always done, adapting to local needs and existing traditions. The holiday can mean different things at once. For some, it is worship and sacred story. For others, it is family and rest. For others, it is a bright season in a dark time. For others, it is an excuse to gather. For others, it is an economic event that they must survive as workers. For others, it is a reminder that they miss someone. All of these meanings are real. They sit together in the same month like relatives at a long dinner table. Modern Christmas also becomes longer. The season stretches earlier. Decorations appear sooner. Music starts before people are ready. People complain, then they adapt, then they complain again next year, because complaining is also a tradition. This stretching happens because commerce benefits from a longer season, and because people are willing to participate when they are already tired and hungry for warmth. The earlier the lights appear, the sooner the dark feels managed. There is a reason people put up decorations even when they say they do not want to. They want the light. This returns us to the oldest part of the story. The solstice, the winter, the need. Even the modern figure of Santa fits into this older pattern. Santa becomes a wide cultural symbol of gift-giving, generosity, and child-centered wonder. He is not St. Nicholas in a simple way. He is a blend. Nicholas, folklore, winter imagery, and modern storytelling. The result is a character who carries a sack of gifts and also carries a certain promise. Someone is watching, and someone cares, and the night might bring surprise. It is a comforting idea. It is also a little funny that adults work so hard to create a mysterious gift giver, then pretend to be casual about it, then stay up late assembling something with confusing instructions. Modern Christmas is full of small, quiet labors like that. The season looks effortless from the outside. On the inside, someone is always doing the work. There is also the modern tension of inclusion. As Christmas becomes culturally dominant in some places, people who do not celebrate it can feel pushed to the edge. The season can feel like a wall of sound and lights that assumes everyone shares the same story. That can be isolating. At the same time, many communities have learned to hold multiple winter traditions side by side. Hanukkah, Diwali in some years, winter solstice celebrations, New Year traditions, and local seasonal festivals. The modern world is crowded with calendars. This can be chaotic, but it can also be beautiful. It means more ways to bring light to the dark. The best modern winter culture is not a tradition swallowing the rest. It is a neighborhood where many lights can exist. And then there is the most personal part, the part no advertisement can fully control. For many people, Christmas carries memory. The smell of certain foods, the sound of certain songs, the feeling of certain rooms, the face of someone who is no longer here. The season can be gentle and sharp at the same time. This is why people return to old rituals, not because they believe rituals solve everything, but because rituals hold space. They give you something to do with your hands when your heart is heavy. They give you a way to say, "I remember," without having to explain everything. In Oslo, on Christmas Eve, many families gather. Some go to church, some do not. Many eat a traditional meal. Many light candles. Many exchange gifts. Many visit cemeteries in the days around the holiday, placing lights or graves. It is quiet, practical, and deeply human, and this is the point where the entire history circles back. Saturnalia brought candles and gift-giving and social release. Early Christianity brought the nativity story and the language of light. Constantinople organized the feast and amplified the symbolism. Nicholas brought the idea of secret generosity. Yule brought fire and evergreens and northern stubbornness. Medieval Europe built community rituals and public storytelling. The Reformation challenged the season and pushed it toward the home in many places. Victorian culture rebuilt it as a cozy moral narrative. Modern life globalized it, commercialized it, and broadcast it into every corner of the calendar. Through all of that, the core remains simple. When the days are short, humans gather. Humans light something. Humans share foods. Humans tell a story that makes the world feel less cold. Even the most commercial modern Christmas cannot fully erase that. You can buy things and still need meaning. You can be surrounded by lights and still need warmth. You can have a tree in the corner and still need someone to notice you. So the soft tension of modern Christmas is not really about whether people spend too much. It is about whether the season still makes room for the quiet things that matter. A phone call to someone who feels forgotten. A plate of food delivered without drama. A small gift that says, "I know you." A moment of rest. A shared walk in the cold air. A candle in a window. A story told slowly so a child can fall asleep feeling safe. That is the best part of Christmas, and it is older than the name Christmas itself. I lock the museum door and step back outside into the Oslo night. Snow is falling lightly now, just enough to soften the street sounds. The lights along the road reflect on the wet pavement. Somewhere nearby, a window glows warm. Somewhere else, someone is laughing. Somewhere else, someone is quiet. The city carries all these lives at once. The season carries them too. Winter will always return. Darkness will always arrive. Humans will always respond by making light, whether with candles, lamps, electric strings, or simply by gathering in a room and being kind to one another for a while. That is the history of Christmas. Not a single origin, but a long practice. A practice of warmth.